But before just starting, also, I want to inform and also reflect one of the founding fathers, Professor Mannan from Bangladesh, passed away last week. Let's remember him as well in our prayers and in our thoughts. I was hoping to host him as well in the coming months in the series. That would not be possible, but we shall remember those who have contributed to the development of this area in very difficult times of the winter of Islamic economics. We shall continue to remember their legacy, and we shall remember them in our prayers. With that, I will leave to Professor Abbas Mirakhor to start on his reflection, and still people are coming, and we'll continue to accept them while the Professor Mirakhor continues his reflection. It is all yours. I'm again very much grateful for your time and allocating this valuable time for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bismillah wa billah wa fi sabilillah wa ala millati rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Professor Mehmet for this opportunity to engage in a conversation with some of the most brilliant second generation economists as well as the third generation economists, as I see the names as people join. Alhamdulillah, shukrulillah. I think that in order to proceed, to use the time as efficiently as possible, I would like to define 3 terms and talk about a framework also for conversation purposes. And then that the Islamic finance took and the path that it could have taken and didn't, to perhaps to reach a point right now where there is this expressed dissatisfaction with the progress of Islamic economics. First, let me define what we mean by economics, because this is really in our conversations. I remember there was this Professor Ali Khan, very early, wrote 2 essays. One of the essays was that he pleaded with us, with all of the Muslim economists, to please get your language right. I think, following some of the philosophers, basically like Wittgenstein, where the emphasis is on the accuracy of the language. We, of course, didn't heed Professor Ali Khan's advice. And so what we say about Islamic economics and where it has been or where it goes gets muddled up. And so let me go and define what at least for the purpose of this conversation, what we mean by economics. There are 2 economics, one with capital E and the other one with a small e. The capital economic with capital E really means the ways and means which are used to utilize resources on an individual and collective level. This is with economics with capital. It's applicable to any thought about management of resources in anywhere, in any culture. So it's a universal idea, economics with capital E. There is also an economics with the small e, which refers to a particular set of ways and means of managing resources. The collection of these little e's together for any economics with small e constitutes a particular economic system. For example, when we refer to conventional economics, it refers to ways and means of using resources, managing resources based on a specific historical, cultural, and ideological experience of societies which gave rise to a system called capitalism. Now, each economics is differentiated from others and identified by a prefix, such as Christian economics, Jewish economics, Gandhian economics, Buddhist economics, socialist economics, and so on. And collection of these economics constitute something called the economic universe of discourse. Now, these elements of this universe of discourse, which are economics with a small e, interact with each other, and borrow from one another, talk to each other, whether they acknowledge officially or not. This thing continues to proceed. A lot of our, mashallah, the second and third generation Muslim economists are very well engaged with this universe of economic discourse. I see the publications that come out in journals all over the world, and they seem very well versed in other systems and other belong to this universal discourse, basically, that we have to be able to interact and explain ourselves. We cannot be insular, and we cannot have a sort of an economic discussion among ourselves in a balloon. We need to explain ourselves to other people as well as to our younger generation, who basically have to be persuaded to consider Islamic economics as a viable alternative to what they learn elsewhere. Now, for these prefixed economics altogether basically represent different ideologies, different methodologies, different world views, and from that we can derive what we mean by Islamic economics. Islamic economic is one of those economics with a small e. Basically, we say Islamic economics is defined as ways and means of managing the resources based on prescribed rules governing economic behavior according to the Quran, and it to its own universe of discourse. For instance, within conventional economics, you have different economics in its own universe of discourse. For example, you have neoclassical economics, you have classical economics, and you have new classical economics. All of them are basically belong to this universe of discourse, which is constituted by conventional economics. So in Islamic economics universe of discourse, you have these various views of what a paradigm of Islamic economics ought to look like. This was the ideas actually were developed with a philosophical and logical foundation at the turn of the last century, around 1910 all the way to 1970s, where that view, which came out of discussions of philosophers, really brilliant scholars, including, for instance, Saeed Nursi in his tafsir of the Quran, provides a really remarkable understanding of microeconomic behavior as it is envisioned in the Quran, and the rules that govern that behavior. Then you have Allama Muhammad Iqbal, who basically laid down the philosophical approach to finding solutions to socio-economic problems of Muslim societies. These, of course, were brilliant, and basically their views were right on the edge. And of course, it was followed by probably one of the most brilliant social critics, Malik bin Nabi, who in the 1950s and 60s clinically and almost surgically analyzed the problems of Muslim societies. All of these would have required, all of them in fact do ask that in order to solve the problem, the first stop is to go to the Quran and converse with the Quran and draw out the Quranic solutions, which is, of course, explained and operationalized by the Sunnah of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and from there use economic or sociology or psychology paradigmic knowledge that experts in these fields have in order to explicate the rules of the Quran in terms of the particular contemporary social sciences. However, this path was not taken by Muslim economists. That is, from roughly about 1970, let's say 7, on to the end of the last millennium, most Muslim economists opted out for something called basically Islamization of economics, meaning finding, or at least this is how Muslim economists who followed the Islamization of knowledge project or paradigm believed that basically that meant a reconciliation between conventional economics and Islamic economics in terms of introducing Islamic values, morality, and ethics into conventional economics. And for example, one of the dimensions of this particular approach was to say, you know, economics as such is okay. Its axioms are okay, but they have to be modified. And the argument, of course, you can build a case saying that what does the conventional economics want to do as its objective? And the answer would be the objective of all little conventional economics within the universal discussion of conventional economics. All of them have the objective of maximizing social welfare. And then they ask, well, what's the objective of Islamic economics if not maximizing social welfare? So it is best for us to engage with conventional economics but modify its axioms, which are troublesome for us. So, for example, if the Quran says the exact measure for every generation and that there is no scarcity, while on the other hand, scarcity is a major axiom of economics, the thing to do is to try to reconcile the two. And how do you do that? You basically say there is no absolute scarcity, but there is a relative scarcity, meaning depending on time and place and the persons involved, you have relative scarcity. Of course, this is for those who are very, very familiar with the Quran, understand that the Quran insists that the problems of economic problems of mankind isn't a paucity of resources, but the way these resources are distributed. So the Quran's major emphasis in economic areas is on distribution, and a just distribution at that, not even production, much less, for example, dealing with situations which have been created by followers of the paradigm of the conventional economics. So during this period of roughly 15 years, this Islamization of economics became the major thrust of advancement or progress or lack of in Islamic economics. So what the idea basically was that most of whatever Islam had to say could be summarized in terms of morality and ethics and the value system of Islam, and these are easily transportable into conventional economics. Whereas right at the turn of the century, probably the first 5-6 years of the turn of this century, or this millennium, the new generation of Muslim economists began to question this idea of Islamization of knowledge. Basically, that the position of Islam vis-a-vis economic questions and economic problems are irreconcilable with those of conventional economics. One of the first people who actually raised this issue was our own Professor Mehmet in an article in a Japanese journal. He raises a question, is actually, you have within the conventional economics, you have this the worldview, the ontology, the epistemology, the methodology, which is quite different from what underlines the philosophical and logical foundation of Islamic economics. And of course, it was followed by two or three other very brilliant pieces, actually, of other second generation economists, in my view. Some of them are already in the audience, and I'm very grateful for their presence. And basically, the idea was that what we now have is this period of 2 or 3 decades in dealing with Islamization of knowledge this paradigm has not produced the kind of traction that one needs for moving forward in solving economic problems of the Ummah. And after all, this is really what we need from an effective paradigm, is to give us solutions to the problems that we all face, that all of our societies are facing. None of that was forthcoming. What happened is actually there was a throwback going back 700 or 1,000 years even, to find solutions in the writings of scholars of the old. Basically, for example, this whole idea of maqasid al-sharia, which has its own validity and principle in many ways. Maqasid al-sharia was actually a product of maybe 1,000 years ago, or even a little more, because it began, basically being articulated by Juwayni, and then by Ghazali, and then by Shatibi, and it continued to create controversy until you reach to Sheikh Muhammad put a sort of a gloss over all of these writings, and whereas, for example, the initial writing identified only 5 maqasid and excluded, for example, one of the most important maqsad of Sharia, which is social justice. It wasn't as part of those 5 maqasid. And Ben Ashur, of going directly to the Quran and finding out what is it that the Quran wants from a Muslim society, going to writings of other people, showed the trouble and problems we had, because we didn't have critical thinking of Muslim economists saying, listen, this is what the Quran has to say to us, not just simply taking verses and verses and verses, but taking subjects together. There is a famous saying that the Quran has only 500 verses that deal with economics and finance and business. It's not true. Actually, there are about a third or maybe a little more than a third of the Quran verses deal precisely with social organization and the economy of the society that is organized based on principles that are enunciated in the Quran. And the Quran gives the rules that govern the behavior of individuals and collectivities. And then the result is a system called iqtisad. Iqtisad is etymology, it's ontology, it's epistemology, it's logic. All of that comes from the Quran itself. So when the new generation of economists ask for a new paradigm, totally independent from let's say, conventional economics, one then is reminded of a kind of game that philosophers usually play. And so if we take a page from their playbook, which means basically they like to pose thought games. To say, for example, if we now assume that you have a whole bunch of Muslims who want to organize a society and its economy and have basically no idea that there is such a thing as conventional economics, what would they do? Well, they do what Muslims had done for almost 1,300 years. They go to the Quran and extract rules of behavior regarding economics from it, organize it, and then, of course, look at the Sunnah of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to see how these rules were explained and then operationalized. And there you have the economic system, which is overall called iqtisad, and was called iqtisad until the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Actually, that was an absolute disaster for development of Islamic economic thought. And so we went into hibernation. And basically the thought, we just kept borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. And then came the writings of people like Sayyid Nursi, like Dr. Muhammad Iqbal, and Malik bin Nabi, Allah yarhamhum jamia. And these opened ways. And they said, now look, this is what in contemporary society, this is what this particular rule of the Quran suggests for behavior of Muslims individually and collectively. Whereas those who were interested in Islamizing economics went back 1,000 years or 700 years to grab ideas, because we didn't have ourselves during that period new thinking of how to do it. They forgot or ignored the developments of these ideas by these very brilliant scholars of Islam. And so we came to the turn of the century. Our young economists, Muslim economists, all of a sudden discovered that they really didn't have a nail to hang their hat on and call it Islamic economics, because it turned out that it is for policy purposes. Because after all, this is the objective, is for Muslim economists to come up with policies that you can then transfer to policymakers, and so that they can design policies, implement them, and solve the problems of Muslim societies. There isn't one problem that you can name in contemporary economies for which there isn't a solution or a response from critics by experts in economics to say, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you do so and so, this action, amal salih that you do has barakah, what does it mean in the jargons of today's economic universe of discourse? It has explanation, it has definition. What does taqwa mean? How can we explain to anybody, including our own young, what is the implication of taqwa, for example, for a working, operating economic system? How can I explain that? How can we explain that? So basically it is a problem of translating what the Quran has to say about how to structure an economy for a society, and be able to then implement, to make policies based on that and solve and address the economic problems of the society. So this is where the young Muslim economists, the second and third generation, are according to Professor Mehmet, have come to a point of stop. Now, my own sense is that actually, over the last, let's say, 60 years, Islamic economics hasn't stopped. It went through a process of self-identification. What is Islamic economics? And basically then you come to the point where you ask yourself, if I don't want to borrow the philosophy, particularly epistemology and ontology of conventional economics, what do I have then? Say, well, you have iqtisad. And one person who during the 1960s explained what iqtisad means holistically and laid down its philosophical and logical foundation in 3 books and then many, many articles, was Shahid Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr of Iraq. And of course, that first generation did not treat his writing either fairly, or for a variety of reasons. Some I can point to, some I prefer not to. It was much of his writings were ignored, especially his writings on the philosophical foundation and on the logical structure, because he was focusing on the fact that if you want to answer questions and address your research to a particular problem that the Quran is dealing with, you need to engage yourself and your thought processes with inductive logic. And as Muhammad Iqbal rahmatullah alayhi said, the Quran was the birth of inductive logic. In other words, up to the time where the Quran was revealed, the inductive logic was not known. An inductive logic which was operational and usable in terms of extracting information and solutions to problems by Muslim scholars. Now, where do we go from here? I want to appeal to both the second generation, which are guiding the third generation, and the third generation themselves, that to begin with, one has to become familiar with the Quran itself, and particularly its ideas and organizing principles of society and its economy. Second, read the writings of the ignored, much ignored scholars. Begin with the tafsir of the Quran by Saeed Nursi, rahmatullah alayh, and then read Allama Iqbal, which lays down the philosophy and the logic of social science disciplines in his writings. He also has a book on economics, which our dear Dr. Zamir is trying to have translated into English, and then move on to Malik bin Nabi and look at how this brilliant thinker surgically analyzes the problems of Muslim societies and creates concepts that up to then was really not known, but are very well understandable with somebody who's familiar with the philosophy and sociology and psychology of contemporary Western thought. And then, of course, you have to have the economic hermeneutics of the rules you extract from the Quran and say, here is what being rule compliant means in Islam. This is what needs to be a movement, economic implications of that. Here is what it means, and so forth. Now, alhamdulillah, some of the third generation Muslim economists, under the guidance of some of the Asutay, some of the professors that are here, are doing some of these. We have some really brilliant PhD dissertations that have come out, and from all corners of the Muslim world. And when we recall that in the 60s and 70s, it was almost impossible to get a graduate school in the West to agree to or approve of someone doing a dissertation or a thesis even on Islamic economics or Islamic finance. MashaAllah, now there are, when you look at the dissertations that have come out only in the last 5 years, they run into thousands. and not forgetting about the books and articles that have come out. So personally, I'm far more optimistic in the sense that, 60 years is not really long enough. I remember that one conversation that Chu Enlai, the foreign minister of China, a long time ago had in France. He was visiting, and while he was giving press conference, somebody asked him, "Mr. Minister, what do you think of the French Revolution?" And he stopped for a minute and said, "It's too early to tell." Meaning 200 years after the French Revolution, he says it's too early to judge the result of that revolution. We have 60 years experience with this modern Islamic economics concept. And within this 60 years, the progress has been enormous. It's been remarkable, frankly. Remembering that it's really took 2,500 years, frankly, for the conventional economics to get where it is, and it has the wrong address. And so we will look at 60 years, and some of our young economists, especially the second generation economists, when you read their writings, there is a sort of sound of despair coming out that the Islamic economics has failed. So we are converging to one of the most important challenges that, had it not been met by, again, some of our brilliant second generation Muslim economists like Shahid Ibrahim, probably would have been devastating to Islamic economics and its progress. And it was this new Weberian idea whose main purpose was to say the problem is with Islam itself, and it's Islam that kept Muslim societies from progressing economically. It has stopped capital accumulation. Everything else that was brought into that picture was, of course, I think would not have been accepted by a usual professor of any economics department, had it not been the fact that the social milieu in the West was ready for sort of the beginning of Islamophobia, and this fed into it. Professor Mehmet, if I keep talking, I will go on, but I noticed that I've already passed the time you gave me kindly. I started at about 8:10, it's now 8:41, so that I'm past the 30 minutes you gave me generously.
Thank you very much, Jazakallah. I really enjoyed it. I didn't want to stop you, to be honest. If you want to go ahead, we are ready to listen to you. It has been an amazing journey to go through the intellectual development, but also the intellectual difficulties. As one of those one of those despairing ones, looking into the difficulties and the challenges we have. But it is important, indeed, I fully agree and appreciate that you raised that issue, that in some of our circles in relation to Islamic banking and finance, some colleagues, some practitioners think that this is the end of history. Replicating Fukuyama's idea. No, it is, I fully agree that this is not even the beginning of our history. Indeed, there's a huge challenge in front of us, but importantly, developing the necessary intellectual acumen to be able to articulate what Quran, what Iqtisad aims to bring forth to make a life in the world, not only for the Muslim world, but humanity, a better world to live, inshallah. And that is perhaps, again, to raise some of the issues that one of the reason of despair I have, such as recent years, we have entirely, it seems that our intellectual acumen entirely going into sustainable development goals. It was something that suddenly we have found, and this has become a new base, which is unfortunately arresting us again. If you could mute your microphones, please, colleagues. And therefore, this shows at the same time an indication of intellectual poverty, that we only jump on the agendas coming from other places rather than generating our own agendas and That's nothing. I don't mean to say anything that is wrong with the Sustainable Development Goals, but on the other hand, unfortunately, we have failed to develop different paradigms to be able to tackle economic, financing, and socioeconomic issues. And therefore, I'm really grateful. I know that there are plenty of colleagues here, and everyone wants to raise some questions and comments. But before going on to them, my curiosity and those students who have studied, those participants here who have studied in Durham, they would know the Iqtisadi approach. Your edited book in 2003, unfortunately, many people didn't see that because it wasn't a mainstream publisher. But the Iqtisad concept, and earlier, of course, Mohammed Bakr al-Sadr's our Iqtisadina. My concern, why, I know that there are underlying issues, but beyond that, why the larger Islamic economic circle particularly opted into economics as a paradigm and framework, rather than trying to locate Iqtisad as the main framework, because the definitions, as you have from the beginning, even the definitions are different. Of course, there was the ignoring of the contribution of Mohammed Bakr al-Sadr, but beyond that, why, for instance, that generation did not particularly come up with more authentic Iqtisadi approach, but rather opted for Islamization? Was it the global political economy? Was it the difficulties in each Muslim country? Or it was because that was the fixed solution? If I could raise that question to you.
Right. Because I was very well familiar to the extent possible with the work of this pioneers, as you call them, which is a well-deserved title. And I had conversations with them between the period of 1965, the second half of 1960s, all the way to, all of them were groping for some sense of identification of Islam's answer to economic problems. Remember, this generation came from a colonial experience, and almost all of the members were trained in the West. Yes. And we were all enamored with economics because not only us, the rest of the intellectual community across the world was enamored with what economics had accomplished up to that point. And so we tended to think frankly, this idea of what was called by an Iranian philosopher, basically that adoption of Western secular ideas, and that the idea was that you're not likely to come up with a system because basically we all looked at the Quran at the time, or at least people of my generation looked at the Quran as providing only few answers. And so if we could only get economics, conventional economics, to accept the idea of prohibition of riba and bring zakat into it, as Asad Zaman has sort of trivialized it, saying that Islamic economics basically means conventional economics minus interest rate plus zakat. That's it. That equality he establishes. I think it's more than that, frankly. It wasn't that people weren't thinking about it. I'm thinking people like Anas al-Zarqa, Muhammad Najatullah Sadiqi, and Rafiq Yunus al-Misri. Some of these people really had been bothered by these ideas as they were floating. Is where do we go? Where do we go from here? Of course, my reaction then, and I believe that we are not exploring, let's say, the writings of people I have mentioned. And I was, to the extent I could become familiar with the tafsir of Said Nursi, writing of Muhammad Iqbal, and writing of Malik bin Nabi, was that this is where we had to go. We had to go to the writings of these people, plus what Shahid Muhammad Baqir Sad had to say. We could then define an iqtisadi economics. I think, frankly, we would have then contributed a lot to the development of the other economies or economics, like conventional economics, that could have solved the problems they faced. For example, we have Islamic finance, which is not, as many people have suggested, is not authentically Islamic, but it become an asset class within the conventional finance. It isn't that people who are in it don't recognize this. They do. If you talk to even, in an honest moment, I remember there was a movie called Giant, and there was this Texan who said, in England, if you go and kick an Englishman who is asleep, he'll wake up talking with with a Texas accent. So I say, if you really get some of these first generation people and to talk honestly, and also some of these practitioners of Islamic finance, and then ask them, do you think that this is what you're doing is Islamically authentic? They will agree it isn't. Their problem is that they are part of an international system that's dominating every aspect of banking and monetary system in our countries. So what do you do in these cases? And this is what they have done so far. But we know where this has to go if it's going to become more and more Islamic. It has to move to risk sharing. And, there are somebody wrote an article that in Islam, we don't have risk sharing. We have profit loss sharing. And unfortunately, of course, this means that such people are not familiar with risk theory. They are not familiar with probability. They are not familiar with the statistics, because for instance, in case of Mudaraba, at the beginning of the contract formation, the two parties have to decide what share they want out of eventual profits. In other words, profits that have not yet been realized. It's going to be exposed. Ex ante, they cannot share profits. They can decide on a share parameter, but in their own mind, they have to look at the risks that are involved. And so when they take a position, they take a share parameter they specify, they are in fact sharing risk with each other. And this is the organizing principle of authentic Islamic finance. And of course, even though people realize that, there is an inertia that won't allow policymakers in our countries to move in that direction. And when you sit down and talk to them and you explain to them how this can work, they agree that it will work, but then they say, but what are we going to do with, let's say, international monetary system that doesn't accept this? And we don't have time, but if sufficient time, can be devoted to somebody who would write the story of the history of development of Islamic economics and Islamic finance, it'll become very instructive and constructive. We don't have that. I mean, we do have some reflections which are basically, unfortunately, are not unbiased and sort of undermine their own value. There are some of the story of challenges that Islamic economics and Islamic finance have had to face, and face successfully, and face it on the same ground as the critics were coming from. I think those would be very constructive. I've mentioned one, but there are more of these challenges that Islamic economics has met, and alhamdulillah, it's still thriving.
Thank you for that. I know a lot of colleagues are raising their hands, but before going to them again, just using my position and exploiting that, you refer to this Weberian position. Do you think this obsession, as you refer to Garbzadeh, the whole idea of being part of the contemporary world, and Weberian understanding, if with the Muslim ethics, if we deal with the capital, and hence we will reach the development. In other words, a very behavioralist approach rather than a systemic approach. Could we say that this has been the dominant attitude in Islamic economic circles from the beginning by ignoring the Iqtisadi approach?
Right. Yes,
because that generation was very much obsessed with the idea of responding to Weber. No, Islam is better, Islam is good, Islam can do it. But of course, it can produce the so-called Islamic capitalism in the end.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. When you prefix anything like economics, you develop this pronoun of me and mine with it. So you become you fall into the trap which Ibn Khaldun called asabiyya.
Yes.
You have intellectual asabiyya as well as nationality asabiyya and let's say tribal asabiyya and so on and so forth. Our intellectual asabiyya, unfortunately, did not allow us to develop this independent economics, Islamic economics. And we are now falling into another trap, a sort of a polar position that says, do away with economics altogether. This would be a grave mistake. Economics, actually, as you know well, conventional economics has two parts. One part of it, which really relies on philosophical and logical framework, which are alien, frankly, to Islamic position. But then it has the same conventional economics, has developed concepts, has developed methods that are basically ideologically either neutral or negative with respect to conventional economics itself. If you give me 5 minutes, perhaps I can give you one example, which is very important, and I think that some of our third generation economists that are present can take it and run with it. In 1912, a British economist called Arthur Cecil Pigou, who was basically a continuation of classical economics with some Marshallian bend. Now, this guy was devoted to the axioms of economics as it was developed before actually Robbins came on the scene. So he was devoted to the idea of liberalism. He was devoted to the idea that, the people have self-interest, the idea of scarcity. All of that was he was operating within that framework. Of course, he believed in utilitarianism. And so in 1912, he wrote this book in which he developed two important concepts. One was the concept of externalities. I don't know if you're hearing me, Prof.
Yes, we do.
One of the idea was theory of externalities, which really he was the innovator of it. And that meant, this idea when developed, it sort of went against the grain of classical economics, which it required government intervention in order to stop spread of negative externalities. So this was one idea he developed. This, of course, is in consonant with the expectation of the Quran that our activities must not have negative externalities. The idea of la darar wa la darar is a qaida, is a principle. And the other idea he developed, he says, with the utility theory, he posited the following proposition, saying that, look, marginal utility of an additional dollar for the poor is much higher than it is for the rich. So if I have a redistribution of income and wealth from the rich to the poor, I increase the social welfare altogether, collective welfare. And he had this beautiful, simple graph that showed marginal utility of an additional dollar for the rich and one for the poor. And he showed that if they met at the middle, that the area under the integral of that actually would be higher than it was previously. Now, this idea, of course, remember 1912. In 1920, another person called Hugh Dalton, developed this, formalized it into a principle, saying that you should undertake redistribution of income to ensure that the social welfare of post this redistribution is higher than it was before. And so it became known as the Pigou-Dalton principle, and it's, you can look it up, and it's a very interesting proposition. Now, why do I mention that? It's because this idea is precisely what the Quran is telling us. Even though he comes from this background that we attack now, mercilessly attack in some of our writings, and we are really beating a dead dog because most of the members of the profession of conventional economics actually agree with all of our criticism against these very narrow axioms of conventional economics. So we don't gain anything by repeating what somebody else is saying. We need new ideas in discussion with these people and saying, look, this is what Pigou had done. And we can make policies that make sense. Of course, he was relying on cardinal utility, and this was something against the rich, which really the wealthy were the ones who determined the agenda of conventional economics. But it continued, they went to ordinal economics and famous theories of revealed preference. Everything was developed on the basis of ordinal utility, not cardinal utility, because they said that interpersonal comparison of utility is illogical, we can't go on, and so on and so forth. But Pigou's ideas continued in different forms. Yes. It came, of course, it's the same idea that Keynes had, saying that marginal propensity to consume of the poor is much higher than marginal propensity to consume of the rich. So if you give the poor a lot of money, then you really increase social welfare. This was his idea. It's restatement of Pigou-Dalton principle. And then you come down, not to present day, we can go through a lot of links, but I will leave that out. Come to today, present day, we have Thomas Piketty. What is he saying is precisely what Quran and Islam holds, that, you have to redistribute income from the rich to the poor. And the way you do it is you tax wealth and you tax income. High levels of income taxes, 2.5%, 2 to 2.5% of tax on wealth, and then you also tax inheritance. So I'm saying that you cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are useful concepts, there are useful methods that conventional economics has developed that will serve us well in explaining the position of iqtisad to ourselves and to other people.
Thank you for that reflection. Unfortunately, Pigou is not anymore taught. The welfare economics are not taught in the business schools either. Unfortunately, we lost that part to entirely financialized discourse. But very briefly, a last question. In terms of the thinking process, would you, I have been raising this issue that unfortunately the thinking process, rather than Islamic thought, shifting to fiqh-oriented thought only, has deprived us to raising important questions in constituting an Islamic economic idea, a paradigm. Because fiqh only looks at whether transferring capital from one place to another is halal or not, but does not question what capital is. However, the major question is what capital is. We haven't defined that. But without defining that, we are looking into whether the movement of capital is halal or not by using Islamic metaphor. And these are essential questions for us, in particular doing Islamic economics and finance. What would your take up on that? Do you think is very much relegating the Islamic thought to fiqh has a role to play here in terms of creating this impoverishment of ideas within Islam, like the Amartya Sen, when he mentioned that when you took ethics from economics, you impoverished economics. Yeah. Similar things I sense here. What would be your take up on that?
No, I tend to follow the advice of Muhammad Najatullah Siddiqui, Allah Yahfazuh, who basically very early said that, listen, where we are putting fiqh first before you develop the basic conceptual framework of Islamic economics. So his idea was you start with the Quran and Sunnah, and then you think critically, and then you can also look at fiqh to see what possible solutions it can provide. I wouldn't dismiss fiqh, because remember, for instance, somebody like Ibn Rushd, who was not only a philosopher but also a faqih, he was the originator in the West of the idea of effective demand, and that comes from fiqh. It's fiqh that initially, 1,000 years ago, developed this idea of mahiyya and maliyya regarding how demand is formed and what constitutes effective demand. And so there are a lot of ideas in fiqh that are very crucial. But you pointed out something which is very, very critical and relates to an earlier question which you raised, very perceptive, that why weren't this first generation of economists ready to accept ideas outside of their own balloon?
Yes.
Because basically they focused on fiqh. And fiqh, particular fiqh, was fiqh of as-sunnah, which is fine, but that meant in exclusion of fiqh developed by other scholars, other fuqaha, other fiqh scholars elsewhere, that could have provided some solution. But at any rate, you had brilliant people like Anas al-Zarqa, whose father, rahmatullah alayhi, was a major faqih of the Muslim world. And basically the idea was whether or not, and you know, he's written one article in Arabic and may have been translated into English, basically deriving Islamic economics from fiqh. And so when you have some let's say implicit asabiyya about a particular system of thought, other system of thoughts that come and are alien. For example, why didn't this generation pay any attention to the tafsir of, let's say, Saeed Nursi? Why didn't they look at what Alam Iqbal had to say? Why didn't they consider, for instance, Malik bin Nabi and his ideas about how to organize a society according to the precepts of the Quran? Basically, because this was this very limited balloon environment in which people talk to each other. And you had thoughts coming from the sort of subcontinent, India and Pakistan, and thoughts coming from the Arab world. And then what happened there is that the thought of Islamization of knowledge, that project actually became dominant. And of course, the philosophy of the Islamization of knowledge was not considered by either the first generation or second generation, unfortunately. Nobody, for instance, has read the philosophical writing of Najib al-Attas, who actually laid down the foundation with new ideas, the philosophy of how to Islamize education. Yes. His idea of at-ta'dib, meaning how do you change a system of education which is basically secular and profane to sacred way of education, which is Islam. That was
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, I mean, my reference is the contemporary fiqh rather than the traditional fiqh that was developed historically. But also, perhaps the generation initially involved, they were very much trained within the narrow boundaries of neoclassical economics rather than the larger political economy, looking at sociology, politics, anthropology, and etc. Okay, I think I have taken more time as well. There are questions the colleagues have raised their hands. I'll start with Professor Mabid Al-Jarhi. Professor Jarhi, is yours.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you, Brother Abbas, for such an interesting talk, and it's just always good to see you. I just, there are certain points that I worry about, and I want to, all of us, to do something about it. First of all, we must consider ourselves when we write Islamic economics that we are interpreters of the Quran. In other words, Quran is our field, and we cannot get out of it. This is our limits. And we are no less interpreters of the Quran than the Sharia scholars, except that we have different tools of analysis and so on. Second, we have immersed ourselves for so long into methodology and philosophy. And still, you know, I get into forums now and I see people still talking about methodology. And it looks like this is the first chapter of a fiqh book about tahara. Yeah, we left the imamah to the politicians and to fractions to fight about, and we are talking about tahara. So we don't want to do that. We want to get into our analytical Islamic economics. The third thing that I want to know is that we have an analytical methodology in economics. This is what we learn in our discipline. We do not have a textual methodology. So there are many Islamic economists who talk like sheikhs, like scholars. We are not sheikhs. We have a different methodology. And I'm glad you mentioned Ibn Rushd, because Ibn Rushd scared the St. Thomas Aquinas. You know, he came out very scared because he found that Ibn Rushd had threatened the Christian creed. It is illogical. It is inconsistent. How can you subject anything like the Christian creed to the human intellect? I mean, but that shows how effective our free thinking based on Quran. Now we need to rebuild the economics. We need to have our own theory of consumer behavior of the firm, not on perfect competition. This is a mistake. I mean, perfect competition is an error. It's internally inconsistent. So we must build a theory that avoids this internal consistency and present it as economists. Of course, we are Islamic before that. We must look, I mean, I was just surprised recently. I asked myself, is there a relationship between time preference on commodities and time preference on money? There is a missing link. Nobody has proved it. So which means that all interest rate theories are wrong, because this is what they claim. And also we have a problem with the Sharia board, not the Sharia scholars, but those who are sitting on Sharia boards in Islamic financial institutions who make mistaken fatwas and apply them with ruses, just like the Jews fishing on Saturdays. So we need to, and if we wanted to, I mean, this is my last sentence, if we wanted to create a revolution in economics, then we must also revolutionize ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jarhi. Professor Mirakhor, would you like to respond or raise any further comment on that?
MashaAllah, all the comments Professor made were all relevant and basically convert to what we have said. Is all, the Quran is the fountainhead of any thinking in Islam, any thought. So economics is not an exception. But his very interesting observation that he says it's recent, but knowing him, I know he's been thinking about it a long time, is this idea of connection between time preference for commodities, time preference for money. I'm risking something here, which he's already criticized, saying that Muslim economists have no business talking about the interpretation of the Quran. So, but I'll risk that. Verse 282 of Surah Al-Baqarah does precisely that. In other words, separates transactions in the commodity sphere and transactions in the monetary sphere. In other words, you buy a commodity right then and there. Then you arrange for a contract. If you cannot pay it on spot, then you have arranged for contracts which requires two witnesses and so on and so forth. The connection that he seeks I believe it's there, and it can be derived from Baqarah 282. And anyway, as a suggestion, I know he can inshallah, he knows much more about the Quran than I know. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. Muhammad Aslam Hanif is waiting all the way from Malaysia. So without waiting in further, go on, Aslam.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Prof. Abbas, for your wonderful presentation as usual. Let me just say a brief comment and then a question. I think when it comes to the way Islamic economics and Islamic finance has developed over the last 4 or 5 decades, maybe we can conclude today that in order for us to move forward, we need to have knowledge of both our Turath al-Islami as well as modern knowledge. Whether this is, limited to economics, maybe not. It would be a wider field, as mentioned by Mehmet. But we need to be able to have critical engagement with both these two inputs in order to develop contemporary Islamic economics. So that's my brief comment about how we should go ahead in trying to develop contemporary Islamic economics. My question to you is, since we do have in this audience, as you mentioned, first generation, second generation, third generation, and moving forward, how would we? What is your take on how we should be planning for that future generation of Islamic economists to come, in terms of the educational programs that we have? So, for example, we have programs in economics, or we have programs in Sharia. But then you go for your masters, you go for your PhD. How do you see the combination of this formal university education in trying to develop the kind of people that you think would be what we need to take Islamic economics forward, in the next 20, 30, 40 years? I think that's a very important part, because many of us who are in the chat today, maybe we are in universities and we are all involved in trying to develop the future generation, and most of the time we tell people your first degree is in economics and go into your master's in economics and then your PhD in economics. But is that the way forward, or is there something else that we should be thinking about and thinking about seriously? Thank you.
First of all, thank you for this question. MashaAllah, as rest of us get old, we become uglier, but MashaAllah, you become more and more spiritual as time goes on.
It's the video, Prof. It's the video. Don't be fooled.
Remember, I've seen you close up. So Anyway, alhamdulillah, this is a very important question. But let me refer you to the writings of the originators of the idea or the project of Islamization of knowledge. Shaheed Ismail Faruqi and his expositor, including, of course, Jabir Taha Al-Alwani, which I'm sure you're personally familiar with. One of the most important things that came out of their writings and their thinking about where to go was this program they gave. For instance, Taha Al-Alwani's 6-point program for how do you Islamize disciplines. The most important thing that came out of there is that you have to develop people who know the field very well, the field you're trying to Islamize, but who also know the Quran very well and are aware of at least of the way the rules of the Quran were operationalized and explicated by Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That, I think, is where we have to start. It's unavoidable for us not to look at the Quran from the point of view of an economist, to have an economic hermeneutics of the Quranic verses that relate to the society and its economy, rules that relate to the behavior of individuals and collectivities. So my sense, of course, that's what we're trying to do, is have, in Malaysia, we did this thing called, the course called the Quran and the Economy. Unfortunately, it was only one semester, so all we could do was give some introduction. This is what we've tried to do in this book. I don't think you have seen it yet, Prof. It's called Ideal Islamic Economy. Basically, it's iqtisad, based on the same ideas of both Shaheed Faruqi and Shaheed Muhammad Baqir said. And so we extracted these rules, tried to give them economic hermeneutics from our knowledge of economics and say, here is what iqtisad will look like. At least this is a version of it. So this is the starting point, is making sure that people, especially to come to graduate school, have a very good grounding in economics, and then have a very good familiarity personally interacting with the Quran. If not, they have to get it in your graduate school. It's unavoidable. Otherwise, because this was the problem of first generation, Prof. With a few exceptions, the general knowledge of Muslim economists, the first generation, about economic rules of behavior that are prescribed in the Quran was very limited. So you had to grope and go back to, let's say, 1,700 years in order to pull out something called Maqasid al-Sharia, which still hasn't produced any empirically verifiable proposition. But then the Quran rules can provide you this testable hypothesis. In fact, a lot of PhD dissertations that are coming out have actually done that. They have taken the rules and basically have shown how empirically you can test it. And so, when the Quran, for example, tells you that, if you give you do something good, you will get 10 times, this is a testable proposition. You can actually test it, and so on and so forth. I don't want to take more time to delve into this, but that's where I would start. That's where I believe that virtually all of these people that we mentioned would start, saying that the fountainhead is the Quran. It's unavoidable that anybody who wants to work in Islamic economics that has to become familiar with the Quran itself on a personal, interactive basis. In other words, there is something called istintaq, meaning making somebody to speak. So making the Quran to speak to you. It requires a personal involvement and interaction with the Quran that really somebody outside of Islam would never understand. Because to us, the Quran is alive. The Quran is not a dead document. It's a live document. It speaks to us individually and to our collectivity.
Thank you very much for that. There's a question from Professor Shahid Ibrahim. Shahid, is yours.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum, Professor Abbas. I'm sorry I'm not putting on my video because I'm just recuperating from an ailment, you know. But I have a difficulty with you know, in the field, and my difficulty is as follows: that particularly those of us who are trained in Islamic finance, we come from mainstream finance, and of course we understand, you know, we have gone through the Quran and the Sunnah, particularly a good tafsir, and the works of eminent scholars like I've interacted with you 25 years ago. You had advised me to look into Ibn Rushd, Ibn Qayyim. Those papers are familiar, but the thing is, when we go through our training, the training we go through in finance is very different from training in economics. Like we, you know, typically like in finance, people don't go through the what you call the different how would I say it? The finance training is quite technical. It's very narrow. We look at how do you basically finance a project, like capital structure, asset pricing, option pricing, and either we go the neoclassical way or we go the behavioral way. And both in these ways, either we are theoretical looking ahead or empirical looking backward. But the thing is, what you call the philosophical approach, which many of our economic colleagues, Islamic economists have, that approach isn't ingrained in our training. Even though we study, we look into. I've looked into many of the studies. Looking into, the early scholars. Ibn Qayyim, Ibn Rushd, particularly on riba. But the issues we face is, how do we design efficient Islamic financial instruments, which you mentioned are risk sharing, efficient institutions and markets. These are the core, these are the focus of our words, but of our works, But then when we generate new ideas out of that, because of the asabiya in the field, there are two types of asabiya. One is within the field of Islamic economics. Okay, there is an asabiya. Maybe we don't belong to a certain a group of people. I don't want to mention anything. Our ideas are not accepted. There is another asabiya, particularly with mainstream finance people. They don't like. There is a lot in the top tier finance journals. They are not open to Islamic finance yet. It's this is the thing. How can we advise us? I mean, I do interact with our colleagues who are Islamic economists and try to understand the philosophical outlook. But sometimes, our approach is very different from our colleagues.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Prof, for this question, and I'm glad you are here with us, and pray that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala give you shafa rapidly. I think you are a bit modest. In the sense that you know exactly how to develop Islamic instruments that are understandable and acceptable to mainstream finance people. Your papers are effective demonstration of this proposition, that you are capable of developing Islamic ideas without necessarily saying this is coming from Islamic finance, and presenting it to a general audience of financial experts. The epistemological and ontological basis of conventional economics is shared by conventional finance. And even though there is no mention of it, you're right that in finance programs, nobody teaches philosophy, nobody teaches ethics, nobody teaches morality. And by some account, this was the reason why the financial crisis became such a huge disaster is because people were behaving against the moral codes of even conventional economics. Moral failure, that crisis. So basically, I suggest that for your consideration, that risk sharing is not a monopoly of Islam or Islamic finance. Risk sharing is something that, right now, for example, sooner or later, we are going to see another disaster, which this risk transfer and risk shifting system is going to cause. The huge buildup of debt, national debts across the world, from Muslim world to the United States and most of the Western world. There was a very interesting article that 8 out of 10 world financial centers are already bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And that in the face of crisis, these 8 centers will be unable to meet their debt obligations. So a disaster is coming, and it's coming because of this risk transfer, risk shifting system. You can speak to that. People are actually talking about the only alternative is to try to reduce the burden of risk transfer and risk shifting. And this is in conventional finance journals. A number of papers that I have looked at over the last few years, I see that this idea of sharing burdens of financial operations is becoming more and more serious. There are companies that are, for instance, one of our interests is to try to find companies and corporations that are basically debt-free. They have zero leverage, and the numbers are growing. People who are basically are working out their debts and basically making them buying up as much or paying off as much debt as possible to de-debt themselves. That means they are moving more and more toward equity, and that means more and more risk sharing. So this is what I would suggest, is that don't worry about the philosophical underpinnings. Of course, it's good to know it. The Quran is very explicit that a risk transfer, risk shifting system is not an alternative. And that the only system that will work for a Muslim society or any human society that recognizes that you are your brother's keeper and your sister's keeper would require risk sharing. That sensitivity is being built up in the societies of the West. How long it will take for it to bear fruits is anybody's guess. But I see that trends moving in that direction.
Shukran.
Thank you, Professor Mirakhor. Thank you, Shahid. Professor Habib Ahmed from Durham.
Yep. Thank you very much, Professor Abbas. As usual, it's good to see you and hear you. A very enlightening talk in terms of the development of Islamic economics. Now, I have a question in terms of Islamic economics in Islamic thought. Sometimes actually we forget the contributions of Ibn Khaldun. I mean, you have mentioned Asabia a few times, but he actually contributed significantly to economics. And one of the Western scholars actually, while writing about him, said economics before economics was invented. Now, I mention him because if you look at his economic ideas, they are actually very neoliberal in terms of protection of property rights, in terms of free markets, in terms of minimum state intervention, low taxes. And I don't know if you remember that once Reagan actually referred to Ibn Khaldun to support his supply side economics and lower taxes. Now, given that he is one of the actually Islamic scholars who have written on economics. And of course, one of the key things which is Islamic about his writings is he refers to Quran and Sunnah when he's discussing the history of civilizations. And one of the key differences in his writings and neoliberal economics is, of course, he emphasized a lot on justice. And I mean, he has a statement that injustice leads to a destruction of civilization. So that has to be incorporated in an Islamic economics framework. Now, my question to you is, if we have this framework, and when you say or you emphasize, not you, I mean, a lot of economists, and you mentioned that Islamic economics have to be very different than conventional. I sometimes question whether we are trying to be more holy than the Pope in terms of bringing in, a lot of these ideas which are maybe not ingrained in Islamic thought. If you look at what Ibn Khaldun has in some ways prescribed in his writings on economics.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for the question, and thank you for all of your contribution as the member of the second generation of Muslim economists. May Allah bless you. There is this concept of representative firm and representative consumer that actually a lot of people in the last few years have tried to show that this is really an empty idea. So whether or not one would consider Ibn Khaldun as a representative scholar of Islamic economics, personally, I'm doubtful. I've read everything that he has written, and of course, you know that he is probably one of the Muslim scholars, aside from Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, which the West has paid huge amount of attention to. So it's not completely correct that very little has been written about him. And as you say, it fits not the liberal tradition, classical liberal tradition, but the new liberal tradition of conventional economics. So if you take him as a representative scholar that talks in terms of Islamic economics, I think that will be disputable. Well, we don't have time to argue about it. It's questionable as to how many of his ideas actually correspond to the Quran itself. He refers to the Quran, he refers to the tradition, he refers to the Sunnah, he refers to the history, and I believe that he's done a useful amount of work, and he should be recognized as such. But he's in 14th century, Prof. We have people who have talked much more directly to what is authentically Islamic economics in the 20th century, and we ignore them. And in my view, their contribution far surpasses that of Ibn Khaldun. Now, I have respect for Ibn Khaldun. A long time ago, like the 80s, I wrote about him. But the point of it is that we have not really delved into the scholars of the 20th century. We have somewhat paid attention to the Egyptian line of, let's say, early 20th century scholars, but not non-Arabs or Arabs in case of Malik bin Nabi. I wish you would, I don't know if you have read Malik bin Nabi, but it is absolutely revolutionary. And I mean, you can't help yourself that immediately your whole thought process begins to change. And you find a disorientation, as you said, we are, as also Professor Shahid Ibrahim was saying, we are oriented toward a particular asabiya intellectually, that whether we admit it or not, we're there. And that shakes you. And you say, what does, for instance, this tafsir of Sayyid Nursi talks about microeconomic behavior of a Muslim living in a Muslim society under the conditions which are described by the Quran. And then you come away with knowledge that is far superior, in my view, than anything expressed in conventional economics. So I'm not suggesting that we should become more Catholic than the Pope, as you suggested, but I'm pleading for our second generation as guides and third generations as students to look at this wealth of information that our previous generations have left to us. In the 20th century, not 13th century, not 10th century, not 8th century, but now, this contemporary time, and they speak to contemporary societies and their problems. That's the only distinction I would make. Otherwise, Ibn Khaldun needs to be studied more. Why not? But there is also this other wealth that has gone ignored.
Okay. Thank you very much. There are questions. I know time is an issue and we tired you off, but there are some questions, if you allow me to raise some of those. Dr. Mohammed Nizam from IIM, are you there? Do you want to ask that question about the behavioral issues? Nizam? No? Are you there, Nizam? Oh, no. Okay, I can read his question. Salam, Professor Abbas. If we develop Islamic economic theories on the basis of the behavioral norms advocated by the Quran, we would end up theoretizing the behavior of Homo Islamicus. Whereas in reality, Homo Islamicus is in the minority in our contemporary Muslim societies. What is your comment on this?
Okay. First of all, I want to avoid these terms. As I said, there are content at all that is useful, whether theoretically or empirically. Representative firm is one, and representative consumer is one, and Homo Islamicus or Homo economicus are also terms that are really are vacuous and have no meaning either theoretically or empirically. But the idea that you have the Quran providing rules, not norms, this is very important for us to distinguish between norms and rules. This distinction has been made by a Nobel Prize institutional economist, the lady, and just a few years ago, made the distinction between norms and rules. That distinction hadn't been made until her time. And she says that difference between rules and norms are that rules have sanctions. In other words, if you don't follow the rules, then you pay sanctions. Somehow you pay for it. There is a consequence to that. Norms are take it or leave it. In other words, you can comply with them or you cannot comply with them. There may be peer pressure to comply, but there is no real sanctions economically or otherwise for people who do not comply with norms. Now, if you look at the Quran says, if you take riba, you have serious problems. And these are the consequences. You are declaring war on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger. If you cheat, if you do this, all of the behavioral rules have sanctions. So calling them norms degrades them, frankly. And, this other new Weberian thought about Islamic economics that came out in the 80s insist in calling them norms that the Muslims themselves did not comply with. And I don't agree necessarily that those who comply with the rules of the Quran are in minority in Muslim countries. Frankly, we don't have an accurate estimate. But I can assure you that their number is greater than what one could imagine, because unfortunately we focus more on the negative than on the positive side of what Muslims do. And we have this habit of basically self-criticism that goes beyond normal sense of constructive criticism of the self. So I would argue that that, first of all, there is huge amount of hope that once the general Muslim public becomes aware of exactly what these rules mean for their lives and what the consequence of compliance and non-compliance are in economic terms, that more people will become compliant with the rules as specified in the Quran. Now, I have seen this happen in my life, long and useless life, perhaps, but I have observed that people understand what these rules, compliance with them will do.
Great. Thank you very much. And there are still questions. Putri, you have been raising the question, and you have been the brave woman. Go ahead.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. To Prof. Abbas, my dear teacher, my dear supervisor, and also to Prof. Aslam Muhammad Hanif, which is my he was my PhD examiner. And thank you to Mehmet for allowing me to have a comment or question to Prof. Abbas, basically. It's been a while, actually. I have this. Well, I know I follow, and I strongly be aware that the problem is on the distribution problem. But when we talk to the mainstream monetary policymakers, in a way, they still couldn't get off from the head of accumulations problem. That they see that in order to have a stable and stronger and more resilient economy, we have to accumulate. We have to merge assets. We have to, in a way, that accumulation is the only way to achieve that one. While disregarding the distributional problems as an effect of the accumulations. And so my question is how to create that awareness to the policymakers, to the mainstream monetary policymakers, who are Muslims, basically, who are listening today. I believe there is this brother Dr. Rifki Ismail and Dr. Rifki Ismail from BI, from Central Bank of Indonesia, for example. How to create this awareness of distributional problem, because it is actually the distinct value of Islamic economics, and this is a way that if we really have the same frequency in seeing the problem, then inshallah we will see that Islamic economics is developing really well and can solve the socio-economic problem that we face today. So that is the questions. Hopefully you can get it, because it's pretty late in Indonesia. It's almost 11 p.m. So I'm sorry, it's mixed up in my head now. So thank you so much for the opportunity, by the way. Thank you so much, Prof.
Well, thank you, Putri, still resisting the sleep and being here with your intellectual curiosity. Yep, Professor.
Thank you very much. Wa alaikum assalam, Dr. Putri. Very good question. Very good question. This obsession with accumulation actually began from this new Weberian idea of really Islamophobia. Basically that, Islam is the problem itself. Now, technically, you go and say, Islam will make growth impossible. It brings backwardness. Why does it do that? Because the measures that it suggests that are distributional in nature will not allow accumulation of capital. This is absolutely false. In this mindset, which is created by conventional economics, the question of accumulation of capital is tied up with concentration of wealth. Islam, particularly the Quran, is not against accumulation of capital. This is why it says you cannot keep liquid assets without putting it right back into the economy for circulation. Because as example, proverbial example goes, it's the blood that circulates through the veins of the economy. And if you hold it, then the body is not getting enough blood, therefore it will sooner or later die. So if your concentration of wealth is tied up to accumulation of capital, as it is in the capitalist system, which is new Weberian paradigm adheres to, then you look at Islam and say, oh, look, it doesn't allow accumulation of individual wealth. In other words, therefore it does not allow accumulation of capital, because they look at accumulation of some amorphous elements of wealth that will then be put to industrial use. What Islam does, it says, no, you have to work very hard and you have to consume, minimum or around minimum that sustains your life and your station in life. But the rest of it you have to put back into the economy. So the question is, how do you finance, or Islamic economics is against accumulation of capital? How do you pool all of these individual savings into liquid form of capital investment that will lead to accumulation of capital? Right now in the West, we have data that 98.2% of all the financial transactions on the stock markets in the United States, only 0.2% goes to capital accumulation. The rest goes into buying and selling financial documents, meaning financialization of the economy, and separation of finance from real economy. So basically, the real economy is starved for capital and capital formation. So these judgments that are hurriedly made without thinking. There is this, to my view, a wonderful article by Professor Shahid Ibrahim in response to this new Weberian paradigm. It's worth reading because it points out to some of the logical inconsistencies and weaknesses of this particular position. So my answer directly would be to Dr. Putri, is that what we have to explain to our own people, like say in policy makers, is that these two are two different questions. You policy makers have to set up systems which fairly accumulates and pools all of these resources that come from individual Muslim and direct them to our real sector investment. So if we can get this mindset changed, because it has gelled in the Muslim economist mind, the ideas of this new Weberian writings of the 1980s, that they can't shake it. You don't have economic growth because you don't have capital accumulation. You don't have capital accumulation because Islam has put in measures that disperses wealth. Whereas it's exactly the opposite, is that the kind of accumulation that you have in Islam is much larger and it is much more effective in terms of directing it to the real sector activities rather than to financial speculation and financialization.
Thank you, Professor Mirakhor. I know you are very tired. Just a few questions, but we'll keep short, inshallah. Colleague Omar Maruf. Omar, you're still around and you want to ask the question? Omar?
Hi everyone.
Yeah.
I'm audible?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I did have a question actually. It is actually a kind of a thing that I will just update you with my background. I am director of operations working with the company here, and a lot of things, and I'm working as a consultant with the startups. So I face a lot of issues that I think that we need to direct. I think first thing is that seeing the panel, I saw actually this update about the Durham University early in the morning, and I thought this was the right thing that I'm actually looking forward for, because I came up with a lot of things which I think that we need to address too. Number first is that we have an economists panel who actually do the research and all the kind of activities which other people are not. For example, I'm from the Department of Operations, or there's other people who are from the Department of Marketing. Actually, we need an interplay of all these departments to actually lead us, to lead to the implementation of the philosophy, to lead to the implementation of all the ideas from the Islamic economics perspective. I'll give a small example. Actually percolating down the pyramid, there are policies that we have what we made, and then we need to actually percolate down to the common man. A recent purchasing activity I saw recently is that a person was trying to get a loan from the bank to get a car, a small activity. But actually, we had a small debate in there, and is this activity permissible in Islam or it is not? And we lead to the conclusion it's not, because you cannot just get a fund and then purchase a commodity. And a lot of these kind of activities. What my problem right now is that we need a structure. For example, for the other departments to actually implement the policies. We cannot read all the things what the economists are doing. We need something filtered out, things so that we will implement in our daily activities, so as to create this, addendum, to create this on the so that we can synchronize our activities.
Okay. Thank you for the question. Frankly, I think that your best bet would be to say the spirit of Islamic finance is risk sharing. And nowhere in the world this risk sharing has been implemented as closely and as tightly and as beneficially than in the Silicon Valley of the United States. Nearly all of the investment there are venture capital. Venture capital is nothing but risk sharing. And you go to somebody who has ideas and you say, well, I will provide financing for you. And once it reaches fruition, then I will take this many shares of your company, and you then provide all the financing and they move forward. So because there is this sensitivity to Islam and Islamic finance with unfortunately the growth of Islamophobia in the West, the best bet would be to say these are successful experiments that are being done here in the most advanced sector of the most advanced economy in the world. Why not copy them? Because, as I said, this intellectual asabiyya that we have, we should set it aside. It's a result we are looking for. We want to make sure that humans understand that Islam wants all humans to share the risk of life together, because it brings them closer together. The ultimate objective being insulate ourselves. We defeat that purpose. The final purpose of Islam is unifying the whole humanity and whole creation, frankly.
Thank you very much. I'll go to Kabir, and hopefully we'll finish with Ramazan, one of your former students. Kabir, are you there?
Yeah.
Go on, Kabir.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brother Abbas, Mirakhor, good to see you. Mavid Al-Zarhi, and many friends. I'm getting older, and the more I grow older, I'm supposed to know more and get less confused, but I'm getting more and more confused every day. I was attending this morning an editor's panel and one of the editors from UK told in front of everyone that when you fail as as a mathematician, you become an economist. And if you fail as an economist, you become a finance professor. So that is happening to me. And if you look at the finance profession in the United States, the whole the intellectual discourse of the finance that exists now in the United States is, for the last 20 years, is being shaped by the engineers from India, from IIT, and it is a total disaster. All the points that you have made, financialization and all these things well taken. But if you come to the economics arena itself, we are in a disarray, right? Even the discussion from the questions. So now one group of economists, even in 20th century, I'm talking about the recent economists, they will say that we should really deconstruct everything, declare a jihad, create a new paradigm by rejecting everything conventional, built on different mindset. Another group of economists will go with the institutional economics. There is another group are saying, come up with circular economy, everything is wrong. Now, if you look the new generation, because you are our guide, Abbas, Mirakhor, Mehmet al-Zarhi, if you look at your background, that you have been trained in the top university in the United States and economics and the grounded in theory, and the contribution that you have made, mashallah, is very good, and it's a guide for us in the future. But we have all this disarray, different schools of thoughts, and a young mind going to trying to understand Islamic economy. First of all, if he does, he doesn't get a job, so he goes to finance because he get a job in the bank. So that's another incentive. But coming from the paradigmic or what should be taught, the curriculum, where to start? I think we need some guidance and direction from our forefathers so that we can show this to our younger generation. It doesn't boggle my mind why a person from Egypt want to come to the United States, University of New Orleans, to study Islamic economics or finance. I'm the only person, and I have very little knowledge. As you said, I can't even, I do not know Arabic, so I do not know the meaning, like the Quran is a live document. So why they are coming? Because in incentive structure, getting a PhD in the United States, he will be more marketable. Can you just, before Allah, I pray that Allah give you another 20 years, just give us a guideline and sort of a parameter, a sort of snapshot how this economics paradigm will proceed in the future. Sorry, I took a long time just to.
No, and first of all, alaikum salam, Prof. MashaAllah, you are a member of the second generation of Muslim economists, and your efforts have been very valuable, major contributions. May Allah keep you long. But you were talking about the fact that as you get older, you know less. That shouldn't surprise you. There is a verse in the Quran that says, when you sleep, we take the souls back to us. Some we keep and some return back, to allow them to get old, so that after knowing something, they know nothing. In other words, the experience of long age is supposed to teach you that you know nothing, at least because there is so much to know. I think that is shared by all of us, not only you. All of us, we get to the point where we say, Ya Allah, I know nothing. So increase my knowledge. Zidni ilman, ya Rab. Constantly we have to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do that. But to answer your question directly, Prof, yes, it is. You say that most of the non-Arab speaking Muslims do not have readily and direct access to the Quran. But then there are books now, there are articles now that have defined exactly what the rules are and their economic implications. I want to recommend one book, but not because I had anything to do with it, but because basically it's accumulation of things that are already there. This book, Ideal Islamic Economy. It came out in 2017. There, as an introduction, we have tried to say, here is what the Quran tells us about how we must behave. And then from there, you can derive testable, mashallah, you have these opportunities that you have there in University of New Orleans with people coming to you, doing dissertation. You can direct them to derive testable hypotheses from the Quran. You know, for instance, up to now, there has been no definition of what does barakah mean. It's an essential element of incentive structure of the Quran for compliance with the rules of economic behavior. It's a multiplier. It's a scalar. It goes from 10 to 700. I mean, it's specified in the Quran. So it's a scalar that is applied as a multiplier to anything. And this is testable because all you have to do, you can do experimental economics. Get a group of people together and say, here is what it is. If you give $1 in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with that intention that Allah promises that will give you at least 10. So do it within the next 10 days, next 15 days. Let's see what, and be careful in observing yourself and everything that comes your way to see whether or not you get this 10 times. If you give $1 of Qard al-Hasana, you get 18 times. If you do, and then it goes all the way. It's a non-linear scalar that plays a huge role in economic growth of Islamic economy. So it isn't that just because we don't have access to Arabic. Look, a lot of Arabs don't understand the Quran. I'm saying this to all the experiences that I have. Some can't even read the Quran. Take it from me. You know, I mean, I have first-hand experience. I had to learn Arabic as a second language, and I know this is how it works. So please don't let that defeat the purpose, which is to bring enlightenment to humanity, that there is a better way of conducting your affairs, both collectively and individually. And other than the book that I suggested, there are also a number of very good papers and a lot of nice dissertations that have actually derived testable hypotheses and have gone through with data collection and showing the results. So I think rather than giving to this idea that views are in disarray, first of all, that is not a negative thing about a growing science, which is the Islamic economics is actually a work in progress yet. As Professor Mehmet said, it's just not even a beginning. It's just we are at the sort of the edges of entering to identifying and authentically discipline called Islamic economics. So we need you, and we need your positive actually attitude of allowing these young people that come to you for whatever incentive they come to you. They're all Allah's work. They are sent to you. They have guide, and then you guide them to taking the effort of doing dissertations that make meaningful contribution to Islamic economics and finance, for that matter.
Okay, you're very tired, but it is your student, former student, Dr. Ramazan Yildirim is waiting for you as well. It's all for you, Ramazan. Go on.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And I will keep my question actually very short. First of all, I want to thank you, Prof. Mehmet, to bring all the great people in one session. I mean, this is really awesome. This is really really big. My question is very simple and very straightforward. And the question is actually, how do we measure success, a successful implementation of, for instance, Islamic economics? When we are talking about the concept of means and ends, we always discuss about the means. Yani, we have to do proper education, we have to implement risk-sharing principles, etc. They're all means. But what about the ends? How do we define the ends so we can actually measure them and say like, hey, we are achieving the ultimate objectives of Islamic economics that is actually measurable? Why am I saying that? And that goes actually to my second question is, convince the conventional Islamic economics or finance setup which is the other side, right? And they are the dominating part. So we have two options, in my understanding. Either we have to Islamize them, so that means we compromise. We have to sacrifice and compromise, which Islam does not emphasize and promote, right? So there is no compromise in Islam. So that goes actually back to the same statement that Prof. Kabir Hassan made, is like, should be hardcore, delete everything, the conventional, and come up with something new. So the point here is, is it feasible? Is it feasible nowadays to implement Islamic economics in world? And if yes, where do you see the potential? Let me say, I have to say country, right? So Asabiya, I mean, you say like one nation ideally, like there's no countries ideally probably, but as soon as we have countries defined, so we already have this split of humanity, right? So one more time, is it feasible to implement Islamic economics, looking at it from three perspectives, that a government is made of legislative, executive, and judicial, you know, so how is that possible? And how do we measure the successful implementation? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. It's good to see you. You have two comments. First, congratulations on the publication of your book. Inshallah, we should pray for a lot of success. Inshallah. I don't know if you can hear me above that.
Yes, we can hear you. I have
beautiful voice, by the way, so I was willing to listen to it. Anyway, the second thing is you have lost weight. Inshallah, it's a voluntary weight loss, not a forced one. On your question, we don't have to, on a ends meet question. The idea of Islam is not far from what Kant had to say in one of those categorical imperatives: act as if people matter. The final objective of Islamic economics is spelled out in the Quran. We don't have to actually speculate about it. The final objective is social justice. It says we've sent prophets and we have sent messages, we have sent messengers to incentivize people standing up for social justice, for justice. So we know the end result is justice for the people in the society, for the whole of humanity, the final objective. So that said, the question is, how do we make this understandable? Our problem is question of hermeneutics. Can we understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and through our expertise, can we then turn it into the lingo of a modern specialist and say, look, this is what Allah wants from finance. It wants finance to share the risk and reward of any transaction which has components within the real sector of the economy. And we don't have to invoke Islam, we don't have to invoke fiqh, we don't have, these are directly from the Quran itself. So as an expert or a financial practitioner, your own mindset, our own mindset has to change from one that focuses on transferring and shifting risk to one of suggesting in humanity we're all brothers and sisters. In fact, there's verses in the Quran I would say that this idea of self is primary because there is no other. In other words, other is myself. For instance, in Surah 17 of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whatever good you do for others, you're doing it for yourself. Whatever bad you do to others, you also do it for yourself. So in this philosophical underpinning of ontology of Islamic thinking, you don't have this other. You have only one nafs, which is trying to improve its own pathway toward enlightenment. So for you as a practitioner in the finance field, changing the mindset is the first thing one has to do. Gearing it toward what the Quran says and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends for humanity in specified in terms of financial transactions, and then translate that into language which is understandable by other practitioners.
Thank you very much for that. But also it is important to remind us again, Iqtisad, the definition of Iqtisad, Qist and Qast as the root. It provides us a framework to understand what is the success, what is the outcome that we are hoping. And with that note, I know we got you very tired, and I'm really grateful. I wasn't hoping to go that far, but there was enthusiasm here, and therefore I didn't want to stop. I'm really grateful for your time. But at the same time, I'm really grateful for everyone. Still, we have 100 people with us, and quite a number of them, to be honest, they are from Indonesia, and there are some from Malaysia. They are still hanging out here, and I'm really grateful for your time, for everyone's time to be here. Thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure to have you, Professor Mirakhor, and hopefully we'll continue this Pioneer series with others as well who have contributed to the development of knowledge as the first generation. As I always say, and I said in the beginning, they have led the light. We have to follow. We have to develop that, in particular with the new generation. We hope that with such circles and the hubs, we can continue to collaborate and develop ideas. As we mentioned, we are not at the end of history, but still we are on the edges, and we have to work hard. We have to develop the ideas. There are plenty of other questions, but time is an issue, and therefore I'm really grateful. And again, just the Ramadan is coming. I pray, inshallah, that you all have a happy and blessing Ramadan, but let's pray that it brings peace, solidarity, and sanity to the world. Unfortunately, peace and solidarity as well as sanity is very much missing. We hope that in particular in the Muslim world, but for the humanity as well, let's pray for the best for peace and solidarity. And hopefully after Ramadan, we will have other sessions. As I mentioned, immediately after Ramadan, we'll have Durham, St. Durham Islamic Economics Finance series. So one lecture by Professor Timur Quran. But after that, we will have the Pioneer series continue with our second guest, which we'll be announcing, inshallah. And thank you very much again. And again, keep in your prayers Professor Manan, who was a great contributor to this field as well. We enjoyed reading his contribution and remember his legacy. Thank you very much to everyone, and may the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be with you all. Best wishes. Thank you again, Professor Mehmet. I'm really grateful.
Thank you. Waalaikumsalam.
Jazakallah khair, Professor Abbas.
Thank you. MashaAllah.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Abbas.
Hello.